I don't know how old I was when I went to my first wedding reception. I don't know if you remember how old you were when you went to your first wedding reception. What I remember, though, is I was a little kid. Maybe I was 7 or 8, maybe 9 or 10. I don't remember. Could have been my Aunt Kathy and my Uncle Gray's wedding. What I do remember was that there was all sorts of music being played and all sorts of dancing that happened. I'd never seen grown-ups dance like that before. But I do remember, particularly, there was one song that got everybody up dancing. Didn't matter how old you were, didn't matter how young you were, didn't matter if you came as a single, if you came to that wedding as a couple, if you came as a family. It pulled everybody out onto the dance floor in one big circle. It was what you might call a wedding reception classic. And it went like this. You put your right hand in. You've heard this before. You put your right hand out. Do it with me now. You put your right hand in and you shake it all about. You turn yourself around. You turn yourself around. That's what it's all about. You got it. Oh, there you go. I was impressed how it pulled everybody onto the dance floor, got everybody into the circle, and even I could participate. Later on in my life, after I became a pastor and I started doing a lot of weddings throughout the 1980s and 90s, I learned there were new wedding classics that were coming along. Some of you may know some of those classics. They're songs we'd probably rather forget, I think. The bird dance, right? You call it the chicken dance? Chicken dance, bird dance. How about the Macarena? You remember the Macarena? And even more recently, there's a newer wedding classic that goes like this. Everybody clap your hands. Okay, I can see there's only a handful who got the electric slide down. Maybe this is more of a hokey-pokey congregation than the electric slide. I was thinking this past week as I was reading Paul's beautiful words in his first letter to the Corinthians about love and about weddings and some of those wedding classics. And then I thought, there are some wedding classics in the worship service at weddings as well as the wedding reception. And some of you've heard those, some of God's wedding classics. I was thinking about Mark chapter 10, verse 9. What God has brought together, let no one tear asunder. Ever hear that at a wedding? I'm sure you have. How about John 15, verse 12? Love one another as I have loved you. We've heard that at weddings. And of course, I think the biggest hit, which we read this morning, Paul's letter to the Corinthians, when Paul wrote, love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way, it's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. I don't know about you, but I've heard dozens and dozens of lay readers at weddings who normally don't go to church or read the scripture who've been asked to get up and read that letter at a wedding, and they struggle through it. But there it is. Those beautiful words that Paul has written on the subject of love. I've seen them on posters too. Seen those words of 1 Corinthians on posters. I've seen them on memes online. They show up everywhere because they are perhaps some of the most beautiful, some of the most profound words on the subject of love. When Beth and I lived up in Cleveland for 11 years, Beth ran a marriage program at the church we served. It was a destination church. We had people coming from all over the world, as well as the United States and Northeast Ohio, to get married in this historic church. We estimated that during the 11 years that we were there, our church did over 400 weddings. I did not do them all. We had some other associate pastors who were so kind to help with all those weddings. But I was thinking about how many of those couples, the vast majority, asked that we might read 1 Corinthians chapter 13 at their wedding. It's the wedding classic in terms of Christian weddings. And in some ways, it's the perfect reading. You've heard me say in past, if all else fails, read the instructions. And 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is kind of an instruction manual in some ways for couples who are pledging themselves, pledging their love to one another before God and before their family and friends. It's a perfect wedding reading in some ways. Well, guess what? Guess what? There's just one problem with that. And the problem is this, that 1 Corinthians chapter 13 wasn't written as a wedding passage. It wasn't written just or exclusively for couples who are pledging themselves in love to one another. In some ways, I think we've heard that text read at weddings so many times that we may have forgotten that these words weren't written by Paul for weddings. They're words not just for young couples. Perhaps the greatest words ever written on the subject of love, they were written for you and for me. They were written for those of us who call ourselves the church. Oh, they are beautiful words for a wedding, don't get me wrong. They're a wonderful passage, and I wouldn't want couples to not use it at their wedding. But the fact of the matter is the Apostle Paul wrote these words not for young couples getting married. He wrote it for young Christians, for those who were part of this new movement called the ecclesia, the church, in particularly the new church at Corinth. If you dig into Paul's first letter, you'll see that in Corinth, the church was already in conflict. A brand new church in many ways, and already they're arguing with one another. Have you ever heard of a church in conflict? Hard to say that with a straight face, isn't it? It's almost as if conflict is much in our roots as the gospel is in some ways. There, Paul's church was in conflict, and not to delve too deeply into the conflict, but one of the things they were arguing about is whose spiritual gifts had more importance within the community. Some were teachers, some were preachers, some were speaking in tongues. Who had the greater spiritual gift? And the Apostle Paul said, look, none of it matters unless you have love. None of those gifts matter unless you have love. And Paul begins the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians by saying, if I speak in tongues of angels and of mortals and do not have love, I'm a loud gong or a crashing cymbal. I don't know about you, I get two images when I hear that. First of all, I grew up in an era when there was a TV show called The Gong Show. Yeah, The Gong Show. The gong is what you got when things weren't working out well. Paul says, if I claim to speak in tongues of angels and mortals, I get the gong. I sound like a gong. The other thing I get when Paul says a crashing cymbal, I was percussion in high school, man. I was that guy who had to count, 156 bars of rests to get that one crashing cymbal time. And I always came in one beat too early or too late. And then when we were cleaning up at the end of the day, you'd set those cymbals on a couple of chairs and they'd slide onto the floor. And everybody stand at you and give you the evil eye because you made so much noise. That's what Paul says we're like. If we claim to have these gifts of God, but our gifts are not rooted in love. And clearly in Paul's church, when people start claiming that their gift is somehow more important than someone else's gift, they start getting at each other's throats. They start to get into conflict with one another. Paul said, you're all looking back the wrong way. You're looking back to the way you used to be, to your old life, your worldly ways, and you need to start living in your godly way. The way of love, of agape love. Now, perhaps the greatest words ever written on the subject of love weren't written for couples getting married. They were written for us. But that's also a bit of a stumbling block. At least for me it is. You see, love isn't a subject at all. Love isn't a subject or a course to be studied for a semester or a quarter at school and then you got it. Love isn't a subject to be analyzed or picked apart and then you understand it. Love isn't an item that we wax poetically about on a Sunday morning and then when the preacher's sermon is done we toss it aside like an old newspaper, put it out to the side of the road for recycling. No, love isn't a subject at all. Love is the way. Love is the way we're called to live. Love isn't even something we're supposed to feel. Love is something we're supposed to do. It's something we practice. My buddy, we call ourselves disciples of Jesus. That word disciple is rooted in the same word that gives us the word discipline. It's what we do. It's our practice, the way of love. Some of you all know my son Dylan. When Dylan was about 6 or 7 years of age, he started getting into magic. He saw magic on TV or in a video or somewhere, I don't know where, but he said to Beth and I, Mom and Dad, I want to do magic. I think magic looks really cool. And so we bought him a magic kit. And when he opened it up, he was pretty excited because the first thing he sees is a wand, and saw some of the accoutrements of the magician. There was a linked chain, and there were some trick cards, and there was a book. And he said, what's the book for? And we said, well, the book explains how to do the trick. He said, what do you mean trick? Isn't it magic? And we said, no, you got to read how to do the trick, and then you got to practice it over and over and over again till you can fool people with the trick and make it look like magic. He said, no, this isn't what I wanted. I wanted magic. We said, what do you mean? He said, well, isn't there some sort of secret word or secret to doing magic? And we said, yeah, that's it. Read the book. Learn the trick. Practice it and practice it and practice it, and then in time you'll get it. Well, Dylan became like little Ralphie and Randy in that TV movie Christmas Story when they got socks for Christmas. Dylan took that book and just tossed it over his shoulder. I don't want to do magic anymore. I think that's what the way of love is like, though. It's not just words set down on a paper. It wasn't just words that Paul etched out and said, here, this sounds pretty, read them at your wedding. It isn't even words Paul etched out for the church and said, here, listen to this. Doesn't it sound lovely, like a poem, and it makes you feel good? No, Paul wants us to live it. That's what it is to be a Christian. It's to live in that way of love. And let me tell you something about that way of love. See, Paul could have used any sorts of a number of words when he was talking about words. The Greeks, they had all sorts of words to talk about love. They had eros, which is romantic love. They had philia, which is kind of brotherly love and respect. Paul used a different word, a word that was not in common use at the time that Paul was writing to the Corinthians. Paul used this word agape love. Or as my brother and fellow preacher Lewis likes to say, in the South we say agape love. I'm working on it, Lewis, I'll get it. Or as we say up in Canada, agape love. That word wasn't used very much at the time of Paul, not much at all. And yet, did you know in the Christian scriptures that word agape shows up over 300 times? That's our word. That's our word. That's the word that the Christian movement, the ecclesia, the church brought into the world. And we brought it not just by words on a text on a piece of paper. We brought it into the world by living it, by practicing agape love. Agape love is this kind of self-giving love. The agape love is a kind of love that wants to lift up not only those we know and understand and care about, but wants to lift up even those we don't. Agape love is the thing that is most clearly representative of the way that Jesus loved all of us. Whether we deserved it or not, whether we understood it or not. And that's the way Paul wants us to love one another, whether we get each other or not, whether we understand each other or not, whether we belong to the same political party or not, whether we have the same skin color, speak the same language, whether we adhere to the same doctrine or not. Love is patient. You do it. You practice it. Love is kind. It's about living out kindness. It's about not being insistent on having others be like us, and then we'll love them. It's about loving others whether we understand them or not, whether we even agree with them or not. That's agape love. You've heard me say before, when people ask me, "Hey Mark, when were you saved?" And they're always looking, for a great story, like, "Oh, I was saved at Christian night at the basketball game," or "I was saved at Christian night on the at the football game." But there's only one answer for me to that question. I think you get it too. The only answer to that question, "When were you saved?" is I was saved 2,000 years ago, when Jesus lived and died for me. It had nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with Jesus and His agape love, His willingness to lay His life down for me and for the world. Didn't have anything to do with whether I was a sinner or not. Didn't matter whether I understood Jesus or His word or understood His way or not. He did it anyway. And Paul says that's the kind of love we're supposed to have for one another. Whether we get it, whether they get it, whether we understand each other, whether they understand us, doesn't matter. Agape love. That's what it's about. I've shared with some of you before. Some of you have been here at MPC long enough to remember Nancy Stevens, Miss Nancy, sometimes called my Savannah Mama. And Nancy called herself my Savannah Mama, which had blessings and sometimes some burdens. But she loved me, and she really lifted me up as her pastor. And I know she lifted up a lot of you. And some of you became members of this church because of Miss Nancy. Someone here today shared with me how Miss Nancy came to you almost 20 years ago and said, "Listen, we got a new preacher at this church. You need to come and hear this preacher. I think you're going to like the preacher." And you've been here ever since. And I remember her very fondly. I remember one time, Miss Nancy, she used to gather up the friendship pads, and she'd write the cards to visitors afterwards, newcomers. We didn't like to call them visitors because visitors just drop in and they don't come again. So you come once, we like to call you a newcomer. And she came into my office one day and she said, "Dr. Mark, I see there's these two people on the friendship pad, Deb and Kelly, and I sent them a note last week, and they came back this week and they signed up again on the friendship pad, and I'm going to send them a card again, but I noticed they have the same address." And I said, "Oh, well, Miss Nancy, that's Deb and Kelly. They're friends of Beth's and mine. We invited them to come to church. They live together." And Miss Nancy says, "Oh," and then without skipping a beat says, "Oh." But then Miss Nancy did something that I still cherish to this day. She said, "Dr. Mark, I know that you and your generation may have this all figured out, but for me, I'm still struggling with it. And I say that I cherish those words today because I said to Miss Nancy, look, thank you for your honesty. Thanks for your authenticity, for sharing that with me. First of all, I want to tell you, I'm not sure me and my generation have it all figured out by any means. But more importantly, you're talking about it. You're sharing with me. I've been in churches where they wouldn't talk about it. They wouldn't say a thing. What they'd do is they'd make Deb and Kelly's life so miserable they'd chase them away. They'd beat them down. They wouldn't greet them with Christian love. But here you're talking about it. You're keeping it on the table. And sure enough, Miss Nancy sent them another card and said, we're really happy you're here. We hope you make MPC your home. And sure enough, Deb and Kelly joined the church. Some of you may remember they had a little girl, Mackenzie, who we baptized here one Sunday. Paul's asking us to love one another whether we understand them or not, whether we even agree or not, whether your generation has it all figured out or not. I think Nancy was practicing agape love for Deb and Kelly, and for every one of us she welcomed here. I think that's what makes MPC so special in my experience. It's a church that does practice that agape love all the time. You know, sometimes we call ourselves Savannah's little church with the great big heart. I think sometimes we say we have a great big heart because we do have genuine feelings of hospitality and welcome, whether people look like us or are like us. The genuine hospitality and warmth, that we do have the feelings of love. But even when we don't have the feelings of love, even when someone's a perfect stranger to us or in need, we're still practicing agape love. I think that's what 1 Corinthians 13 is all about. It's not just love that's a noun, it's love that's a verb. It's not that just love that's something you think about or you get like a subject in school. It's something you do and something you understand by following in the footsteps of Jesus, who loved us that way. Agape love, it's not just what we feel, it's what we do. And so we put our patience in, and sometimes we put our patience out, and then we put our patience in, and we move it all about. We do the hokey pokey and we turn ourselves around. That's what it's all about. Praise be to God. Amen.